Sorry, this is too loud. Before we begin with Costas Lapavitsas, I want to remind you of the awesome party that's going to be at Sveavägen 53 tonight. There's going to be poets, music. It's at Sveavägen 53. I just want to remind you that you need to pay on beforehand. You could swish a number. I don't want to read it up now. You can see posters around the ABF. So do that. There is a possibility to pay in the entrance, just so you know. And please, 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 come. Yeah, that's what I have to say. Over to Daniel.
Thank you, Mani. My name is Daniel Hedlund, and I represent the Swedish Kvarter Association, which is one of the organizers of this conference. Kvarter is a non-partisan socialist organization that publishes the journal Kvarter in Swedish 4 times a year. The association also arranges meetings and seminars on different political topics and texts, mainly in Stockholm, but also in other parts of the country. One of the main aims of Kvarter is to critically explore the times that we live in from a socialist Marxist perspective. Based in this critical and Marxist outlook, Kvarter took initiative to invite Costas Lapavitsas. He is Professor of Economics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies of the Federal University of London. As a scholar, Costas Lapavitsas' research interests include, among others, financialization, the relationship between finance and development, and between market and non-market relations in the financial system. Drawing on this expert knowledge, he is a vocal critic of the financial system, the EU, and the Greek debt crisis. Costas Lapavitsas also has first-hand experience of the interaction between EU politics and Greek politics, as he was elected to the Hellenic Parliament in the January general elections of 2015 for the party Syriza, a parliamentary seat that he left following the government's agreement with the EU on the Greece's debt. Costas Lapavitsas is also the author of the 2018 book, The Left Case Against the EU, published by Polity Press. In this book, he presents convincing arguments that show that the EU is beyond left-wing reform and also presents some possible strategies for resistance. He points out that class relations play a key role in the interaction between EU member states. Thereby, he also reinforces the relevance of Marxism in the political analysis of the EU. At a moment in time where large sections of the mainstream left have backed down from critiquing the EU, Costas Lapavitsas' perceptive analysis of the development of the EU and Brexit politics has of course stirred up debate, a debate that would need to be expanded to include Sweden too. There are 2 Kvarter issues made available here in this room for you to grab. These issues contain an interview by Kajsa Ekis Ekman with Costas Lapavitsas, and also a translation of one of his texts. I also want to mark it that Costas and Kajsa Ekis Ekman will have a conversation following this keynote session, starting at 4 p.m. in the Palme Room. We are therefore very happy to have Costas Lapavitsas here with us today for a much needed injection into our own debates on the EU and what we can learn from Brexit. So please give a warm welcome to Costas Lapavitsas.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like first of all to thank the organizers, to thank the Kvarter and the editorial group for the invitation. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here. This is the first time that I have visited Stockholm in Sweden. So it's a learning process for me so far. I hope that what I have to say will contribute to your debates, and I hope that we have a productive give and take to the benefit of all of us. Now, I've been given considerable leeway regarding what I will talk, and I've been thinking about it for some time, deciding how to structure this presentation. Because, you see, it seems to me that this is again a time of renewed political unrest. The wheels of history are moving again. It's clear. Chile, Lebanon, Egypt, Hong Kong, many places across the world, unrest is manifest. Political evolution is again moving rapidly. It is also a time of great discontent, universal discontent with the environment, the dangers to climate, the general state of human existence, which you find particularly among the young in Europe and elsewhere across the world. It is finally a time of great disillusionment with economy, society, and politics. There's a profound sense of disillusionment across the world, and certainly in Europe. It is beginning to look like the end for neoliberalism, for globalization, and for financialization that have characterized the last 4 decades. It is beginning to look like one of these moments when history shifts from one regime to another, from one regime to the next. So I wanted to talk about that in the first instance. But I must also say that at the same time, this is also a moment of great historical weakness for the left. This moment of transformation is also a moment of historical weakness for the left. A moment of ideological retreat when the left globally seems to have lost confidence in itself and in its own ideas. And it is also a moment of political retreat because the main constituency of the left, the organized working class, is at a moment of historical weakness again, a time of retreat for the class for itself, to use a Marxist term. So it is a very complex historical moment. The wheels of history are moving in the direction of social solutions, perhaps, but the subjective force that will make for that and the political expression of that force, the left, are not in the best of health. So I wanted to discuss these issues with you, and I wanted to do that in the context of Europe. Because for us, and I mean all of us across Europe, these events are inextricably linked with the European Union, with what's happening to the institutional framework of political and other life in Europe, the European Union. And conclusions about what is happening to the European Union in this respect can only be drawn by taking into consideration concrete evidence, and the most concrete evidence has been offered to us by Greece and by Britain, Grexit and Brexit. So I wanted to discuss these issues in the context of the European Union, and then draw on the experience of Greece and the experience of Britain to tell you what I think should be a left response to the great questions of the time. So let me get on to the issue of where Europe is going straight away. With the European Union, what can we say about it? I think in order to answer that question, the first point to make is that the crucial feature of the European Union during the last 3 decades is its neoliberal transformation. its neoliberal evolution. I don't think there's any doubt at all that since the Treaty of Maastricht and the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Union has been moving in a neoliberal direction, which has been solidified and captured in two fundamental institutional changes, both of which I will briefly discuss. The first is the single market. The single market, about which so much debate has taken place in Britain and elsewhere. The single market is a characteristic feature, the dominant feature of the European Union right now. And it is basically summed up in the famous, or some would say notorious, 4 freedoms. The freedom to move goods, to move services, to move money, and to move labor across the internal frontiers of the Union. To this one should add a 5th freedom, the freedom of establishment of small and big businesses across borders within the Union, which is just as important, but is much less discussed. But let's leave it at the 4 well-known freedoms for the moment. Those freedoms were established in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. If you look at them in the abstract, they will look like reasonable conditions for arranging interstate relations. But of course, what has happened since Maastricht and around that time is that they have been reinterpreted as individual rights. When you reinterpret these as individual rights, you are creating a solid legal framework for the promotion of neoliberalism. And that's precisely what has happened to Europe, or to the European Union. When I look more closely at the 4 freedoms, and in order to understand why that has happened, I am struck by one thing that to a Marxist should be fairly obvious. The 4 freedoms correspond precisely, exactly, to the 4 forms of capital in what Marx describes as the circuit of capital, the fundamental movement of capital as it goes about its business. Capital in the circuit takes the form of money, takes the form of commodities, which are goods and services, and takes the form of money, of workers, which then results into money again. The 4 freedoms correspond to the forms of capital in the circuit, and that is not accidental. In interpreting the 4 freedoms that constitute the single market, Marx's theory goes a long way towards explaining why they're so important. They are basically guarantees of profitability for European big business, European big manufacturing capital, European big banks, and so on. That is their main purpose, and that is why they're interpreted as individual rights, and that is why they guarantee neoliberalism as well in Europe. They are terms to protect the profitability of European capital against labor. Not much then about single market. The other element of the neoliberal evolution of the EU is, of course, single money, the single currency, the monetary union, which is a complement to the single market, an integral complement to the single market, and has come increasingly to be the backbone of the European Union. It does so by providing a rigid mechanism of austerity and a rigid enforcer of neoliberalism in the form of the European Central Bank and in the form of the European Stability Mechanism, which I will discuss in a minute. At the same time, the single currency, single money, is also the source of profound economic malfunctioning for the continent as a whole, as it delivers its services. So when you look at this totality as a whole, what can you say? What have we got? We've got a transnational juggernaut, a giant, something built in this way, based on these 2 pillars, single market, the single currency, with a set of incredibly powerful institutions, all of which are there to protect its neoliberal outlook. The list of institutions that do that is very long. European Central Bank, which I've already mentioned. European Stability Mechanism, which I've already mentioned. Parliament, which I haven't mentioned, but all of you know. The Commission, which is also very important. The Council, which is extremely important. And last but not least, in this short list I've given you, the European Court of Justice, which is the ultimate guarantor of the neoliberal character of the European Union. It is fundamentally a set of institutions that are unaccountable, anti-democratic, impervious to popular will, and guarantee the direction of the European Union in towards the strengthening of neoliberalism. But there's one more thing I would like to add here, because there's a debate, ongoing debate on the left, across Europe, and I'm sure it happens here in Sweden too, regarding the nation state and this totality. What is the relationship between the nation state and this complex totality? Well, I'll tell you that much. Behind the European Union is the nation state. Or to put it differently, the European Union is unthinkable without the nation state. There is no opposition between nation state and the European Union. The European Union has been created by European nation states, and it has been created by the ruling elite, the historic blocs of a number of European countries, for reasons of domestic interest in the first instance. State and European Union go hand in hand. The European Union does not transcend the European nation state. On the contrary, it provides a different abode for its functioning. The European nation state is not going away. It's here, it's in the European Union, and it dictates its functioning, and that is how it's going to be. It's not going to change. Now, why? Two reasons are crucial. The pooling of sovereignty, which is so well known about the European Union. In other words, the surrender of sovereignty by the member states to a certain extent, under subsidiarity and so on, is an excellent tool for each domestic ruling class, each domestic historic bloc of the member states, to undertake policies that generate domestic unrest, policies that are against domestic labor, against domestic working class, to undertake these policies under the umbrella of a foreign directing presence. The European Union is the best excuse for the Greek ruling class, the British ruling class, the French ruling class to introduce measures which are directed against their own domestic workers. That is well known. But there's another element to it too. The pooling of sovereignty among these ruling classes also facilitates the emergence of a hierarchy among them. It facilitates domination and neo-imperialism. It facilitates the creation of core and periphery, a ranking of ruling classes and states in ways that we haven't seen in Europe for a very long time, and it hides it under the facade of partnership and togetherness and participation, equal participation in this process, which I will discuss again in a minute further. Now here is the European Union in my view, which some of you might find extreme, others would agree with it. But what I want to say is this, what I want to focus on is this. Where is it going? Where is this juggernaut going? Well, I can make 3 points about that. Economically, in economic terms, and don't forget, this is first and foremost an economic process. It is something that began as a customs union to protect steel and coal production. That's how it began in the 50s. First and foremost, it's an economic thing. Economically, it's going nowhere. It is at a complete dead end right now. It is a dead end because the productivity of labor is not growing. It's stagnant across the Union, and particularly across the core countries. It's remarkably stagnant historically. Second, technological evolution and the introduction of new technologies, ability to compete on artificial intelligence and so on is extremely weak, even among the core countries. Europe is lagging behind in these fields. Third, it's going nowhere because finance, the sphere of finance is fragmenting, breaking up into different components. The European banks and European financial institutions remain extremely weak. And so altogether, the Union is an entity which globally presents us with a picture of low growth, uncertain prospects, and at the same time, huge inequalities in the distribution of income in particular countries, including the core, to which I will come in a minute. This core is matched by peripheries, which I've mentioned. The Union, as it stagnates economically, it also diverges. There is no convergence. Don't let anyone tell you that there is a convergence. On the contrary, there is divergence. There's a core, and not one periphery, several peripheries. The core is itself unstable. Germany is the leading country now. France is the other element of the core, but it cannot really live with Germany economically. It cannot compete with German capital. If you look at the periphery created by this core, what you see is several peripheries. You see the periphery of the south, Spain, Portugal, Greece, certain types of economy based on the public sector that used to provide jobs, with weak industry and weak ability to compete in the global markets. These are economies that are becoming service economies, and mostly tourism and so on, providing that kind of, those kinds of services to the core. You also see another periphery in Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, which is basically directly attached to German productive capital, which is machine tools, cars, chemicals, and so on. This periphery is doing differently from the southern periphery. It is attached to German productive capital, but it is performing very differently to southern periphery. You also see other peripheries, I don't want to come to it. The Baltic countries, that's another periphery, behaving quite differently to the southern periphery and to the Central European periphery, and so on. So, one core, several peripheries, that's the reality of this stagnating totality. But the core itself is highly unstable too. And the surest sign of instability is offered to us by Germany. The dominant country of the European Union, economically and politically to a certain extent, exemplifies the dead end in which the European Union finds itself. German capital has become dominant in the European Union, not because of its intrinsic strength, not because of its ability to invest, its ability to innovate technologically and to dominate markets through its competitive strength, its inherent competitive strength. That's not what's happened. German capital has come to dominate the European Union because of the euro, this peculiar structure, the single currency imposed on the euro, and because, at the same time, German capital has suppressed wages domestically and kept its own workers under very poor conditions domestically. And then, in that way, has managed to create a competitive advantage for itself. But if you think about it for a minute, you will see this is a weak basis on which to compete globally and to dominate others. It's not the power of Germany, of German capital, that allows it to dominate the EU. It's the EU that has given Germany a means to dominate Europe. That's basically what has happened. And the weakness of German capital is manifest when you look at the infrastructure of Germany, which is poor because of the lack of investment. That reflects what's been happening in the European Union altogether. Germany is an exemplar of this generalized weakness of the European Union. At the same time, if you look at Germany from the perspective of the condition of workers and from the perspective of social issues, you see the reality of Europe in black and white in front of you. Incredible social inequality. Germany is one of the places in Europe that has become unequal most rapidly, more rapidly than anywhere else. The shift of the distribution of income in favor of capital and against labor the last 20 years has been dramatic in Germany. Inequality has gone through the roof, and at the same time, the conditions of the working class in the labor market and so on, for large sections of the working class, are simply appalling. That is the reality of the core of the European Union. So economically, this totality is going nowhere, absolutely nowhere at all. The question is, where is it also going politically? And that's the second issue I want to mention. Politically, then, I would argue that the European Union is also at a dead end, quite clearly at a dead end. Why? The simplest way to see it is because the European Union is actively and increasingly denying democracy. It is actually emptying democracy of its most fundamental content. And it does that by depoliticizing economic policy. Above all, by depoliticizing economic policy. We've reached the state of affairs in Europe where economic policy, perhaps the most crucial aspect of government policy, or certainly one of the most crucial aspects of government policy, has become depoliticized. And what do I mean by that? I mean the following. In Europe, formally, you can vote for the far right or the far left. We've had experience of that. Parties that appear to be of the far left and parties that appear to be of the far right. You can vote for them. You can elect them to government. Syriza in Greece appeared to be a government of the far left. It wasn't, but it appeared that way. Salvini in Italy was a government of the far right, in a way, a component of the far right. Both of them originally were critical of the European Union, from a different starting point, but critical of the European Union and its policies. Once in power, both of them came under the same pressure by technocrats, so-called, by the Commission, by the mechanisms of the European Union to apply similar policies. Why? Because that's what the economy demands. That's what economic reality dictates. That is what the people who've studied at the big universities tell you is economic theory. In other words, what's the point of voting? Nothing. Whatever you vote for, in the end, you will have to follow the same policies. Economic policy has been depoliticized, emptied of its content. In other words, democracy has been hit between the eyes. Because if people cannot vote on what economic policy they would prefer, they will not vote altogether. They will think that elections are useless. And that's what we observe in Europe. The emptying out of democracy, because what's the point of participating in the democratic process if whatever I vote for, I end up with the same policies as far as economy, welfare, and so on is concerned. So, in that context of denying democracy, and I don't want to give you any more examples, I could have mentioned the charade of the Spitzenkandidaten process, whereby a mechanism is created to vote for the new chairperson of the European Commission, and then in the end, what do we end up with? All that process is shoved aside, and the new leader of the Commission is someone who is chosen behind closed doors, without any real democratic process in place. I don't want to go more into that. I've said enough to indicate that democracy is retreating across Europe, and then it's not a surprise that as a result what we get is the emergence of right-wing nationalism, turmoil over immigration, the strengthening of right-wing views, the strengthening of views from the right that challenge this reality based on outright right-wing nationalism. Which brings me back to the left. That's the reality of the European Union. Where is the left in Europe confronted with that? Now, the left is in an incredible state of being in Europe right now. It seems to have lost sight of class analysis and lost sight of class politics. It seems to be meandering in a world of identity politics, looking for some principles through which to position itself in Europe and to confront these issues of European society and European polity. And we've reached the astonishing state of affairs in which a political current, the European left, that has its historical origins in the French Revolution, goes back to Robespierre, and goes back to a tradition of challenging European institutions, the kingship, and the institutions of feudalism and the institutions of bourgeois Europe that followed, and so on. A political current that basically used to be the embodiment of challenging European institutions and demanding a different state of affairs and a different state of society. This political current has gradually become the biggest defender of existing European institutions. Because the main European institution at the moment which defends European capitalism is the European Union. That is the set of institutions that guarantees European capitalism for reasons that I've just explained to you. And we have the incredible state of affairs in which the left across Europe, in different ways, it's not exactly the same, but you will find pretty much similar views wherever you go in Europe, is a defender of the status quo. It wants to defend the European Union and it wants to improve it. It wants to change it. It misreads a set of institutions, the European Union, which is basically a setup that defends European big business. It misreads it. It thinks that it can be a set of institutions that protects the interests of workers and of the working class, and it can be made to deliver benefits to working people. It can be made to deliver benefits to workers across Europe. That seems to me an important reason why the left is failing to give leadership to the unrest, to the need and the demand for something new in Europe that we observe all around us. If it is to do that, if it is to respond more creatively to what it has in front of it, then three things are crucial. And with these, I want to conclude my talk. The first of the things that the left must do is, of course, to offer a programmatic response, a coherent programmatic response to what I think is the end of neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization. It is time that the left in Europe began to offer a coherent programmatic response to that. Now, interestingly enough, the broad parameters of that response are clear. There is much agreement among the left, wherever you turn, about how to respond programmatically to that. From my perspective, I will mention the following 6 elements to a programmatic response. The first is obviously to lift austerity. The left must have a program which demands the lifting of austerity. In other words, the active use of fiscal policy by governments in order to support economic activity and in order to boost employment and defend the welfare state. It is absolutely unacceptable that European governments operate under the pole of austerity and cannot use fiscal policy in these active ways right now when interest rates are so low as well. That's the first thing. And I think that's clear across Europe. The second element to a programmatic economic response, however, and there is less agreement on that, is that the left, in my judgment, should promote the idea, demand an industrial strategy. Europe needs an industrial strategy individually for each country and for the continent as a whole. It needs an industrial strategy that will shift the balance of economies away from services, away from finance, towards the productive sector, towards manufacturing, industry, and so on, to create jobs and to begin to strengthen the productivity of labor again, which is very weak in terms of growth at the moment. Now, if you think about that, such an industrial strategy, it is manifest that it cannot be successful without public ownership over key resources. It is the third element of such a program, is public ownership over key resources, and by that I mean something very specific. Public ownership of energy and its creation, public ownership over transport, public ownership over a range of utilities, water, electricity, and so on. It is unacceptable that these are in private hands, and it is unacceptable, of course, that welfare mechanisms that support these things are in private hands too. So public ownership over these things, over these areas, of these resources, is a fundamental component of the industrial strategy we need. Fourth element, though, goes beyond that. We also need public ownership over banks and banking, and that must go with control of banks and control of capital flows across borders in Europe and more generally. We need to put the financial system and the financial institutions back into the box. We need to control them, and we need to have public ownership of a key financial institutions in order to support the industrial strategy that we're aiming for. Fifth element of the program is, of course, profound redistribution of income and wealth through wages and through tax policy of across the board, over wealth and so on in society. The levels of inequality in Europe are embarrassing in particular countries. Finally, element 6 of the program, I think we need a Green New Deal, quite obviously. We need a Green New Deal to confront the issues of the environment, which are a big concern of this conference, and rightly so. I do not believe in degrowth. I think degrowth is not what the left should be advocating. I think that we need a Green New Deal, and I think that we need to tweak and finesse the elements of the economic program that I mentioned to you in the context of a Green New Deal, which is perfectly possible, to aim for zero emissions within a reasonable period of time, and to do that through a process of public investment that would create jobs and that would get the rest of the economy going and support the areas of the economy that would be hit by the rebalancing of economic activity away from the existing use of fossil fuels and so on. I think that's perfectly possible, and that fits with the rest of the economic program that I've outlined to you. If you take that all together, it's a set of reforms. But these are the definition of reforms that go to the heart of hitting capital and favoring labor. These are the types of reforms that the left has always, in the past, known how to promote. They are reforms that change the balance of class forces against capital in favor of labor. They are reforms that put the economy and society in a direction of transformation, which ultimately goes to socialism. They are socialist reforms. When they're undertaken by organized social forces and under the leadership of the left, they become socialist reforms. That's exactly what we need to be putting on the table now. That is the content of socialist transformation in the current period, as far as I'm concerned, in economic terms. So that's the first element. Second element in this program of the left is, of course, a program, independent program of political renewal. It isn't just economic transformation that we need. It isn't just a shift of economic forces away from capital and towards labor. We also need political renewal. We need to re-strengthen democracy precisely because neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization have harmed democracy dramatically the last 3 to 4 decades. The left must be the champion of democracy, and it must do so in real and concrete terms, not just in words. We need then a program of political renewal to strengthen democracy, wrest control away from capital. For that, we need to re-emphasize popular sovereignty. The concept that is of crucial importance politically for the left is popular sovereignty. Sovereignty that begins at the level of the neighborhood, applies to the workplace, moves to the level of small town, moves to the level of a city, to the level of a country. Popular sovereignty is the key element of democracy from the perspective of the left. That is what guarantees and gives to labor the ability to project its own interests and to demand that these interests are satisfied and to have the means of making that a reality. Without popular sovereignty, we will go nowhere as a political current. But, and this might be more controversial, we also need to combine that with ideas of national sovereignty. National sovereignty, as the left has always understood it. National sovereignty from the perspective of workers. National sovereignty in the sense of protecting the area in which the working class of each country lives, moves, and acts. The area in which it can realistically influence policy, on the basis of which it can be internationalist. Which brings me to the third part of this program, which is precisely this: a restatement of the gap, the abyss that separates workers' internationalism from the transnationalism of capital. The confusion over this issue on the left is phenomenal from my perspective. People continue to confuse the cross-border transnationalism that capital promotes for its own purposes for internationalism. That is not workers' internationalism. That is the transnationalism that big business wants. There is an abyss between that and what workers mean by internationalism, have always meant by internationalism. I can make that concrete by discussing the famous freedom of movement of labor of the European Union, which I mentioned originally, the part of Maastricht and Lisbon. What is the freedom of movement of labor? It is many things, but the freedom of workers of the member states to cross borders and to seek employment across borders without very many protections, we'll come to that in a minute, goes hand in hand with the absolute denial of freedom of workers from outside the European Union to seek employment within the European Union. It is a Eurocentric freedom that defends incumbents within the European Union in the interests of big business. It is nothing to do with genuine internationalism. It is actually a divisive thing that sets aside a relatively small number of European workers and from the huge masses of workers outside Europe, in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. And therefore, that in itself is the ultimate cause of people dying in lorries in London. People coming from Vietnam and dying in lorries in London the last few days, being smuggled in illegally. Of people dying as they cross the Mediterranean, trying to find a new life and sinking in boats that are barely worth being classified as boats. And finally, it's the ultimate cause of people being shut off, imprisoned essentially, in concentration camps along a string of towns and places in the southern littoral of the European Union. Some of these concentration camps within the Union, some of these outside the Union. That is a direct result of free movement. That is the policy of the European Union as far as labor is concerned. A worker-based policy on immigration would be very different, totally different. It would redefine citizenship under present conditions. It would redefine citizenship, and for instance, in the case of Britain, it would immediately give citizenship to all those EU workers who are currently in Britain and have lived there for a period of time. It would guarantee their citizenship, it would protect them, it would protect their families. It would also propose reciprocal rights of movement between Britain and other states in Europe and elsewhere. And finally, it would seek to regulate flows of labor in the interest of protecting those who are coming in, who need access, protected access to welfare, meaning medical protection, housing, and so on, important things for workers, vital things for workers, but also protect the incumbents, protect workers who are already in a particular country, whose conditions will be directly affected as others are coming in. That is a labor policy. That's got nothing to do with the freedom of movement guaranteed by Maastricht. That is a policy in the interest of big business. These are the three pillars, I think. Economic program, democracy, and internationalism from a worker's perspective that would allow the left to position itself creatively and actively in Europe at the moment. So I can ask, can this be done in the European Union? Can we engage in a policy of this type? Can we propose a policy of this type in the European Union? I need only ask the question to show how ludicrous it is. It is impossible to do that in the framework that I've summarized for you in terms of what the European Union is. Manifestly impossible. But then some people on the left, occasionally people who ought to know better, people who have experienced the European Union, but seem to have learned nothing from it, come up with a view that yes, we know the European Union is problematic, but we will remain and reform it. We will remain and reform it. And some in England, Britain, some who have obviously got no idea of what the European Union is like, add to this, we will remain, reform, and revolt. They want to revolt within the European Union. This is where absurdity reaches the complete pinnacle. Now, I will leave the revolt side out of the equation because it's just words. And I will ask, is it possible to remain and reform? Is it possible to do that? Because that is an argument that encourages the left to say, we're in favor of this ramshackle thing. It is bad, but we will remain and reform. And I will ask you, reform what? Whenever I ask that, the supporters of remain and reform are remarkably silent. I have yet to hear of a concrete proposal of what to reform. Where will you start? What exactly will you reform? You see, when you talk about reform, it sounds very plausible and very appealing. Whenever I ask people who advocate this what they will reform, there is a paucity of answers, a remarkable positive replies. We will think about it. Well, we've had 4 decades to think about it. It's a long time. I told you what I think reform should be. I spelled out my set of reforms. Whenever I ask people then what are their reforms, it's quiet. So I'll do it for them. Let's suppose you want to reform the flows of capital. You want to restrict the flows of capital because you think that capital must not be able to cross borders freely because that's speculative and it generates economic instability and it facilitates big business and big banks against the interests of workers. How would you achieve it? Insofar as that is a result of the primary law of the European Union, the primary law is basically treaties, the treaties of the European Union. The treaties of the European Union can also be changed through unanimous agreement by all member states. Good luck to you in getting unanimous agreement. Insofar as it depends on secondary law, in other words, the acquis communautaire, the directives and so on, and laws of the European Parliament and so on, insofar as it depends on secondary law, any kind of reform such as this, controlling capital, it would require qualified majorities in the main bodies of the European Union. Qualified majorities mean majorities that cover a majority of the member states and a majority of the population at the same time. It's not enough to have a majority of the member states, but you must have most of the population. Arguably, that is even more difficult than getting unanimous agreement. There is no chance at all for those who understand how the system moves and works. There is no chance at all. I can tell you without any qualifications and any qualms that this is the reality. Why? Because the system was built in the first place to be impervious to the popular will, to be impervious to left-wing change, to be impervious to socialist demands. It was constructed in that way. And the idea that you can do it from within doesn't cut it. Doesn't cut it at all. Remain and reform is nothing. Nothing. Which leaves me, in the 5 minutes I've got available to me, to tell you what I've learned from the 2 concrete cases from which we should all learn, Greece and Britain. Because I don't want to leave you with a sense of thinking that nothing can be done. Things can be done, but not in the remain and reform direction. What have we learned then from these 2 most important political cases as far as the left is concerned? Greece comes first because chronologically it came first. It's not the most important case. Brexit is more important. But Greece comes first because it's a big lesson for the left. Greece focused, the issue in Greece focused on the euro. It taught us something about the monetary union. Brexit was first and foremost about the monetary union. That part of the totality. Now, any sane economist in Europe or elsewhere would agree that Greece has got no place in the monetary union. It's a nonsense, unless the economist is a Greek. in which case, very often they would be in favor of Greece continuing to be a member of the European Union for political reasons or cultural reasons. So rational economics will tell you that Greece should not belong to the monetary union, but it continues to belong. It has remained in the monetary union. Why? Why has it stayed in? It wasn't Germany that made Greece stay in. It wasn't the lenders that made Greece stay in. It was its own ruling elite that actually insisted that Greece should stay in. It was united as a bloc. There was no ifs and buts on the part of the Greek ruling class that it will stay in the euro, whatever the cost. Why? Because they knew that that was the way to protect their interests in the way that I outlined originally. The European Union was the best place for them to be, and the monetary union was the best place for them to be, irrespective of the cost. Anything else would have been far too dangerous for them. Syriza originally challenged that. Syriza was an alliance of left organizations, came out of nothing. It was not connected to the Greek state. It was the political organization that was most detached from the mechanisms of the Greek state. It challenged that perspective indirectly, but in choosing the actual political line on which it challenged for elections, it fought for elections, what it maintained was the Remain and Reform argument that I discussed previously. Fundamentally, Syriza tried the Remain and Reform argument in practice. It believed that by gaining political legitimacy through elections, it would propose to these sensible people in the Commission an alternative program, and surely they would see the sense of it. Surely these are our partners in the European Union. They will understand that we are proposing a sensible thing, and they would give us something. If they give us something, then the process of change will begin, and in fact, eventually the whole of Europe might be affected by this. Little Greece would catalyze a dramatic transformation. What did they get? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. Zilch, nothing. Not a dicky bird, nothing. Why? Because, of course, the European Union would not accept a challenge to these mechanisms that I outlined to you from who? Some upstarts in Greece. They destroyed them. They destroyed them. They destroyed us, because I was in the middle of it. They destroyed us, and they forced on Tsipras and his friends a surrender. They surrendered. They accepted the program of the European Union, and look at Greece at the moment. It's been stabilized. It's the stability of the cemetery. Greece is dead, basically, on its feet. It's going nowhere. It's a society that is moving nowhere. What's the lesson of that? Peripheral countries, especially the southern periphery, has got no business in the monetary union. Exit is the only answer for these countries. But more broadly than that, the monetary union is going nowhere. It's basically a deadening mechanism. Europe doesn't need it. Europe doesn't need a single currency. We can live perfectly well without the single currency. Sweden knows it. We've got evidence in the north. So the sooner that this is dismantled, the sooner that this is replaced by mechanisms to control foreign exchange and the flows of capital, the better for Europe. And the left should be clear about that. The left in Europe should not be in favor of staying in the monetary union. If it learned one thing from Syriza, it's that there is no left program that goes together with Euro participation. We need to exit that. But let me come now to Britain, and with this I will finish. Britain is obviously a far more important country than Greece. It's historically an imperial country. It's a country that has helped shape the direction of the European Union in the neoliberal sense that I outlined. It was very important in doing that. Brexit is more important than Grexit because it poses directly the question of membership of the European Union, not the monetary union. It goes right to the heart of the problem. It poses the question of the European Union. But there's one more difference with Greece, and that is this. The Greek ruling bloc was united in the case of Grexit. It was united that it wanted to stay in the monetary union, no matter what. It never shifted. the British ruling bloc is divided. There's a profound division that runs through the British ruling bloc between those who wish to exit and those who wish to stay. And it's a division pivoting on sovereignty. This division is what has made Brexit so different from Grexit. It's the division at the top which has allowed the anger from below to manifest itself so effectively through the referendum and everything that has followed. That's what's made Brexit so complex, and that's what has brought out the difficult aspects of it. Similarly to Syriza, though, the Labour Party in Britain, the left in Britain, has again failed to offer effective leadership so far. It is torn. It doesn't know which way to go. The leadership understand that the European Union is a constraint on economic policy. But the membership think that the European Union is somewhere where the left should be. The membership believe that you can stay and you can remain and reform. And that creates an impossible situation because, of course, the electorate, where the Labour Party gets its support from, very often, and in concentrated working class areas, is for leave, is for Brexit. So it's a very difficult situation which the Labour Party has failed to handle and to offer effective leadership. In that context, the right has taken the lead, and now Brexit has become a right-wing affair. The Brexit we've got on offer is a Brexit led by the right. And that creates huge problems for the left, because the left does not want the European Union, but it's the right that is offering solutions to working people, and it's the right that is cornering the political debate because the left is weak. So what conclusion and what lesson can we take from that? Exiting the European Union is a more complex affair than exiting the monetary union. The monetary union is straightforward. But exiting the European Union goes to the heart of what the country is about. European countries will continue to trade, will continue to exchange resources, even after the European Union will have ceased being what it is. A system of regulation is necessary among them. A system of an agreement of how trade will take place is necessary among them. Exiting the European Union doesn't mean becoming an independent entity, doesn't mean becoming a state in yourself, doesn't mean becoming an island, even if Britain is an island. Exiting the European Union means finding new relations with your neighbors. That is a difficult thing to do and a time-consuming thing to do. The left must think carefully and propose complex ways in which European nations can continue to interact with each other beyond the market and beyond the neoliberal constraints of the European Union. That is the lesson of Brexit, and that is how it should be approached. The left should not want to stay in the European Union, but what it should propose is a complex situation, a complex state of affairs in how a workers' government in Britain can take both Britain and Europe ahead, can offer new ways of trading, new ways of exchanging people, goods, services, and so on. This is not an easy prospect, but then the left is not for easy things. The left ought to be dealing with difficult things and not to be proposing solutions for those. I've spoken for a long time, but it's a difficult issue. I've given you what I think is a way of dealing with the problems of Europe right now from a Marxist perspective, a Marxism that understands the current world, understands what class struggle means in Europe, and wants to offer solutions that can command majority support, solutions that are radical solutions for Europe, that challenge European institutions, and offer the prospect of socialism for Europe for the 21st century. I hope this debate continues along those lines because I can see no others. Thank you very much.
So then, time for questions. We have 2 mics out there.
Okay. Can you? Yeah. Yeah. I have a question. What would a country do a euro member do in terms of when leaving the euro, the new currency would obviously probably be less valuable, so there will be problems with debt in foreign currency and imports becoming dearer. So in terms of, would you need more national self-sufficiency and so on? I mean, this is probably an argument against leaving the euro, so what would you respond?
Should I take that directly or wait for another or no?
Can take it directly.
This is a key question of leaving the euro, obviously. It's also a question that matters for the European Union, because leaving the European Union would also affect trading relations. And what kind of trading regime does one want with the European Union, which is the form in which this has emerged in Britain. Specifically on the euro, I would say the following. The question of leaving the euro and what it does to imports and exports differs according to country. So it poses itself very differently for peripheral countries than it does for core countries. In core countries, certainly Germany, leaving the euro means going back to the Deutschmark, and it means higher value for the currency. It means currency appreciation. And there the impact is also very dramatic for German exports and so on. But you asked me about fundamentally a peripheral country because you assumed depreciation. So what I would say for that is that the euro has basically created a system of fundamental imbalances in real effective exchange rates. There is no formal exchange rate in the monetary union among countries, of course, it's common currency, but there are exchange rates which are implicit, effective, and do not appear. They have to do with how price levels are related to each other. And what the euro has done is to lock in a situation in which the terms on which Greece, for instance, exports, or Spain exports, and so on, is systematically is affected by systematic overvaluation of the exchange rate. The exchange rate is too high. That is part of the problem. So any shift out of it would obviously lead to a fall in the value of the new currency. What would happen then will depend in the way in which this would take place. I would say that what the left should be proposing is a system of foreign exchange controls, regulation of exchange rates, which is perfectly possible, that would limit the fluctuations. Greece needs a lower exchange rate. Portugal needs a lower exchange rate. But it doesn't need the market to dictate that. It doesn't need the foreign exchange market to dictate that and to destroy the exchange rate by producing a collapse. So I would argue that in the first place, we need a system that would regulate and manage these transformations, including for Germany. Germany doesn't need to get out of the euro for the new exchange rate to go through the roof and to destroy German exports. So that has to be regulated too. Can we do that? Well, yes, it's possible. For example, the European stability mechanism, the European monetary system, the EMS, the mechanism that preceded the euro, is still extant. It exists. It exists, but it's a sleeping mechanism. It can be activated to mitigate exchange rate fluctuations. If that was not forthcoming, however, and the country was blackmailed, which is the case in Greece in 2015, then the only way out would be to prepare the people, to prepare the population for what has to happen, not to have secret plans and ridiculous secret cloak and dagger negotiations between clever ministers of finance and various others. That is nonsense. But to prepare the people, to prepare people for what is coming, to alert them to it, and to take measures to mitigate the impact of the first transformation, which would be severe for a period of time. The exchange rate would fall and then it would rise again. if the population is prepared, it can take it. We saw that increase in the summer of 2015 when the referendum was put to the Greek people about what to do with the lenders. Ostensibly, that's what the referendum was. But in practice, it was about the euro. And everybody knew that because the lenders had made it clear. And the right wing in Greece had made it clear. This is about the euro. If you vote no, you're voting to exit the euro. And people voted to exit the euro. And they did that because other issues were considered to be more important than the impact of exiting. Issues to do with sovereignty, popular and national sovereignty. People will do it. So what you've got to do is prepare for it. These occasions don't happen every year or every 6 months. They're historic occasions. The left has to be up to them because he needs a clear perspective. Unfortunately, the Greek left did not. It did not at the time, and he messed it up. So that's what I would say. Yes, there will be a cost. It can be, even if it was a case of dealing with it individually, it can be done. It can be done if you prepare the people for it and you take appropriate measures to deal with it, and if you find a political message that will allow the cost to be taken by the country, to be borne by the people.
More hands? Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate on why you think degrowth would not pose a solution.
Sorry, who's asked that?
Shall I repeat?
I got it, but degrowth, you want to know. Shall I take it or?
I have also a question here. It's basically the same, but
Yeah, but
So I can't see, I'm sorry.
We'll do this two questions then.
yeah, it's on the same topic. But I guess your vision then sounds like you believe in the decoupling idea. And
Can
that's
you
the
just
same.
lift your voice a bit?
Sorry, it's the same issue here with the growth thing. Your vision, though, sounds a lot like you believe in decoupling, the idea that, and the idea that you can decoupling like the environmental destruction from the growth of the market. So I guess it's the same.
I understand that. I mentioned the degrowth argument consciously because I thought that I would be touching a sensitive spot. Rightly so, because this is a big debate on the left. I respect the degrowth critique and the degrowth arguments about capitalism and what it does to the environment. But the absence of growth doesn't persuade me as a mechanism to deal with issues, and it doesn't show to me that actually you can deal with even the problem of emissions satisfactorily. The contraction of growth that you will need, the contraction of GDP that you will need to reduce emissions significantly through a degrowth process would be phenomenal. You're talking poverty. And in the context of a country like Greece, which has had degrowth for 10 years now, the GDP of Greece is 25% lower. I mean, how much degrowth can you get? There is no significant change of emissions, proportionally or otherwise. To argue that you need even more in order to generate a state of environmental well-being that's acceptable, to argue that you need even more degrowth is very, very problematic politically and socially. It seems to me far more persuasive for the left to argue for a policy that aims for zero, say, emissions as far as fossil fuels are concerned, or other environmental measures, through active promotion of clean energy, through active promotion of a variety of means that we know are feasible. We can plan it, we can measure it, there is work to that effect, and we can deliver it while also delivering economic and social transformation that we want to see. We can introduce new economic activities under different ownership and control structures. We don't need private business to do it. We can do it through associational, cooperative ways that will deliver what we want in terms of the environmental aims, while also protecting livelihoods and protecting employment and allowing the rebalancing of the regional economies of particular countries. Say in the case of Greece, which depends a lot on oil, it imports its oil, but it also depends on domestic production of lignite to generate electricity, which is the worst type of fossil fuel, very, very polluting fossil fuel. We can propose a policy that will replace that kind of energy source with clean energy, utilizing the sun, utilizing wind and so on in complex ways that will also promote employment and will defend growth. I prefer that as a strategy. I think that fits with what the left wants, and it can also facilitate the emergence of new forms of social organization locally that would empower workers rather than private business. That to me seems like a better, a more effective strategy for the left as far as the environment is concerned and as far as the climate crisis is concerned. I don't know if I'm answering you, but that's what I think.
More questions? Seems to be in the middle. And
Yes.
we'll collect them.
You had a lot of very good points, I think, about the political program for the left.
I can't see, sorry, who's speaking?
My name is Bengt Håkansson.
Ah, okay.
Okay. But I was missing one point, and it's about the migration. And I think you have to address that question. And especially in this country, who is taking care of more migrants per person than any other European country. And it has also led to a split between the left and the working class here. So I think you have to address that question and have a very clear policy about it.
We'll collect another one.
About degrowth and so on, just remember the example of Cuba when they had no oil. They are the most ecologically sane country on earth. I wanted you to elaborate on the thing you talked about, national sovereignty and workers' internationalism. Because when we in Europe are marching in solidarity with the Kurds, we are talking about national sovereignty, right? We're talking about, when we talk about Latin America, we're talking about patria libre, free country. But we never talk about that in our own country. Yeah? So I wanted you to elaborate a bit on that so we don't get so mixed up with what is nationalism and what is not. Thank you.
Maybe those two questions go together so they can be...
They're quite close, yeah. In a sense, we're going right to the heart of the political problem for the left today, the most difficult issues, migration and popular national sovereignty, basically. These are the political issues. We can all agree pretty much on the economic program, give or take several sides, right? But we can all pretty much agree who would want to see austerity, who would be against public ownership of a key areas. Most of the left would agree on these things, though when you put them in practice, you're going to get complexities. But when it comes to these issues, the reality emerges very harshly, because obviously real politics is never simple. Now, when it comes to migration, Sweden, and to a certain extent Germany, saved the honor of the European Union the last few years, because the performance of the European Union over the issue of the Syria and the flows of people from those war-torn areas through Turkey and Greece and so on, the performance of the European Union over that was appalling, quite simply appalling. I mean, a continent of hundreds of millions of people could not find space for 1 or 2 or 3 million refugees that simply could not survive where they were being kicked out of. That they paid Turkey to keep millions of people in essentially concentration camps, hugely overexploited by local capital, basically. That's the policy of the European Union. So Sweden, first and foremost, but also Germany, rescued something of the honor of the European Union as far as humanitarianism is concerned. But obviously that's not a long-term answer. It cannot be a long-term answer, and that's not a policy. What is policy? Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that I've got the final answer to the migration problem, nor that what I will tell you now is, that's it, the defining policy. But I do know certain things when I see them. And I do know the difference between what would be a workers-based policy and a capital-based policy. Capital wants to see people crossing borders. At certain times, capital wants to see people crossing borders freely because they're exploited freely. And that holds for the domestic freedom of movement. You bring Romanians to England, they live on next to nothing and they work for very little, and they have problematic access to services, and that's very fine because you can make profits in agriculture that way, or in the building industry, the building trade, and so on. Even more so, you bring Africans in and so on, you can make profits that way. Workers' policy is different. Workers' internationalism is a different thing. Workers' internationalism doesn't mean open borders and just that. Open borders means nothing. For borders to be open in reality for labor, there has to be protection for labor as it enters, protection of its conditions. There has to be access to medical care and medical services. There has to be access to housing. There has to be access to education. These people have to live like normal human beings. They have to have rights to these things. Otherwise, it means nothing to give them the right to move in. It also means protecting the rights of incumbents. In other words, protecting the rights of working people who are in the country that we're talking about. If you put that on the table, then you realize what the size of the problem is. Let's take a country like Denmark. Let's not talk about Sweden. Let's take a country like Denmark. And assume that in the current situation of a population of 6 million or something like that in Denmark, you allow 2 million people to come in. Can you sustain the welfare system with 2 million people coming in? I doubt it. Most probably not. So what would you do? Clearly, that's not a policy in favor of workers. That is a contradictory policy. Therefore, you need something that says people come in with rights and protections for those who are here. In other words, you need to regulate flows. You need to be clear who comes in and under what terms. Otherwise, chaos follows. The conditions of the domestic labor gets worse, and the conditions of those coming in become worse. Workers understand that. And labor unions have always understood that. They've always understood it, and they've always had policies and reactions that interpreted these things in practice and had practical policies to give content to the freedom to move. Not just generalities and empty words that make people feel well, but in practice mean nothing. Open borders, in the case of the immigrants or refugees between Greece and Turkey, means absolutely nothing. Nothing. What these people need is safe passage, a right to move from where they are trapped in a safe way towards where they want to go. That's what a workers' policy would be. How to move these people and under what terms. Can we propose something for that instead of talking about open borders? Because that means nothing. So the workers' policy, when it comes to freedom of movement, must be a policy of regulating and controlling from a workers' perspective. Just like a workers' policy is necessary for goods, for services, and for capital. Just like we want to control that, just like socialism means that we have conscious social policies when it comes to that. We also have it for people who are moving across borders, recognizing their rights, and having a policy of citizenship in place as well. Because they have to become citizens wherever they move, and we give them terms and conditions under which they do so. That's how I would approach it, and that's how I suggest the left needs to think about it in this country perhaps and elsewhere. Which brings me to the question of sovereignty and internationalism, because this touches upon it directly. Sometimes, people think, in some ways, to bring a personal thing here, I'm the embodiment of Europeanism. I left Greece when I was about 17, and I've lived in England for a very long time, and I've traveled and worked in a number of different countries and so on in Europe. So I understand how this ability to move works in practice because I've lived it in practice. I can tell you it's got nothing to do with internationalism. It's got nothing to do with internationalism. This is transnationalism. This is the ability to cross borders and take advantage of different situations, which the middle class like very much. Why? Because there's nothing that the middle class would like more than stepping on an aeroplane, using your credit card, stepping off the aeroplane, using again your credit card, and think that the world is international. It's not. That's not internationalism. Okay? That's not internationalism. Internationalism is about, in the first instance, who is sovereign wherever you live. Who is sovereign wherever you live? Who makes decisions? Do the poor, do the plebeian layers, the working class, have a say? And does this say count for anything? Can they bring change where they are? And when they express their views and opinions, does anybody take notice? That's where internationalism begins. If you've got that, if you've got sovereignty where you are, if you control those narrow areas, and then you expand the control over the rest of the mechanism of the nation state, basically, the national framework, then you can hope at the same time to project that internationalism. You do it at the same time, but you can hope to project it internationalism. Then it makes some sense to say, we workers control the center of Athens, or areas of Stockholm, and we have something in common and share it with workers in Barcelona or workers in Berlin. Because it means something, it's real. If you don't control anything, and you just proclaim internationalism at that level up there, it's just hot air. Just words. Popular sovereignty is where internationalism truly begins, because that is where workers' internationalism makes sense. That is where you can begin to structure laws, policies, institutions that allow for this perspective of society to take root and to spread and truly to generate fraternity among working people across Europe and not just Europe, not across the world. So that's how I would go about it, and I would say that this has got nothing to do with nationalism. Nothing to do with nationalism. The best guide to that, and I will finish with it, is of course Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, where he says workers have got no country, and workers are international in outlook, but for that to be effected, workers must first become the nation. Karl Marx says that, not me. Workers must first become the nation. In other words, they must transform the nation, which is their natural environment, in their own image. The nation must become what workers understand by the nation, not what the bourgeoisie understands by the nation. Because nations exist. Nations exist. So workers must transform the nation in their own image, and that's the basis for internationalism. Then that's what would be workers' internationalism rather than the transnationalism of capital. I have nothing else to add to that.
Yeah. I see 2 hands, 3 hands.
Hi.
We just have a few minutes, so we'll try to make this short. We'll collect all of them.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you very much. I would like for you to comment on the European Green Deal. That is
On the European?
European Green Deal, as you've mentioned, the Green New Deal as a potential policy proposal for the left within the European Union, as the European Green Deal has been asked of Commissioner Frans Timmermans to be put forward by Ursula von der Leyen, and also the prospect for the left and the Green to affect the content of the European Green Deal.
And is there another one, or that's it?
Yes.
Should I say more?
I would like to ask, like, if you take the why there is not more like popular opposition towards the European Union, referring to the things you've been talking about now. If you take Sweden 20 years ago, we had quite a slim referendum where we joined, and it was considered quite a leftist position in many cases to be against. Today, the majority support is bigger, even though there's also people who don't want to be. And as far as I know, also in Greece and in other countries, there's still quite a lot of popular support, even though it's probably decreasing. So why is that? Is that because of, would you say,
because of subjective reasons that the left has not offered leadership, or are there also other explanations?
Okay, another question. Thank you for the speech.
Where I can't see, sorry.
I am here.
Okay.
Okay, so there's a proposition from an economist called Bernard Leiter that Greece should have two currencies at the same time, like that you keep the euro for tourism and exports, and then you can have your own domestic currency for the domestic market, so you can like make use of the domestic unused resources, and in the same time have this stable euro currency. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah.
I think we have to draw a line there because there's just a few minutes left. So, yeah, we'll start. I think we'll finish with those.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
On the European Green Deal, I don't have much to say. Partly I would have to say a lot. We have to sit down and discuss it in detail. The only thing I would say is that, yeah, I mean, I would be in favor of any starting point such as this. I would be supportive of that. But I would seek to strengthen it and bolster it when it comes to the investment dimension, and possibly measures such as debt forgiveness to go with it, to allow different countries that haven't got the wherewithal to support what it needs through debt forgiveness, make it more radical, in other words, in this respect. And I would also want to see a strengthening of alternative forms of property and control over the agents who will supervise this Green New Deal activities. In other words, cooperative activities, association activities, and so on. I think that's very, very important because that transforms the social foundations. This and shifts it in the direction of labour and against capital. Whether the left and the Greens can cooperate on that, I think the Greens need to rethink the European Union a little bit more, somewhat urgently. Some of them do it, some of them don't. If the left needs to rethink the European Union, so do the Greens. So there is potential for cooperation. This is essentially a white front, right? So there should be scope for cooperation, but the Greens need to do that, and I think they need to think of the social implications of a Green New Deal, not simply pose it in terms of humanity facing a problem that affects everybody. There's no such thing. Problems that affect humanity usually always have a class dimension, and that class dimension is of paramount importance too, as I've indicated in discussing the Green New Deal in practice a little bit. So not much about this. As for the two currencies for Greece or other countries, this is an idea that's been floated many times. It was floated at the time. For a period, I mean, I myself suggested that it might be possible, not so much to create two parallel currencies, in other words, the euro and another currency, but two different forms of currency, as in scrip, stamped money and properly issued money to allow for the liquidity needs of the transition. When you actually look at the proposal of two currencies in parallel, however, one the euro and one the domestic currencies, which is what has been suggested here, that's not a good idea. It's not a good idea because what it would do is basically to shift the costs of economic transition and economic shocks after the transition onto working people, because they'll be using the domestic currency, so the costs of any kind of devaluation will be borne by these people and these sections, the working class and others, and that would protect capital that deals in euro with foreign transactors. It's a mechanism to defend capital insofar as it does anything. It's also a mechanism to create constant instability between two different price systems, one in euros and one in domestic money operating concurrently in one country. That's not a good idea. So on the whole, I'm not in favor of that. I argued against it. if there is to be exit, it has to be back to a currency that is domestically controlled. That is also a fundamental element of sovereignty, controlling your own money in order to formulate your own monetary policy. Which brings me to the last question, with this I finish, on the left and the euro. Why has the left fallen for the euro? No, sorry, for Europe, for the European Union. It's the question of the age. Why? It's a mystery. And when the Greek business started, let me put it. I'll give it in terms of Brexit, and Brexit is the best way because concrete events are the best. When the Greek business started, I can tell you one thing: the economics of it is worth one weekend. It's simple. Greece has got no business in the euro. You have to be an idiot to think that Greece belongs to the euro, or blind. So I thought that surely people will see that. And maybe not in 1 month, maybe not in 2 months, maybe not in 6 months, but at some point sense will prevail, right? And it will be understood that this country should not be in the euro if it wishes to grow, and so on. I also thought that there is no way that the Greek population will take the costs of remaining in the euro. I didn't expect income to contract by 25%, but I was sure that it would be devastating. I didn't think that it would be as big as that, but I had no doubt that it would be devastating. So I assumed that the working class and the population as a whole would never take that cost. It did. And it did because the left encouraged it to do it. Why? What was it? What explains that? At the level of working class and the people, there are two elements here. One is fear, the other is identity. Fear of the change. Any shift of that type, especially when it comes to money, generates fear in ordinary people because money is something we all have. All of us have got some money in our pockets or in our cards. So the idea that you can change the unit of account suddenly in one day from one to another and don't know what will follow makes people feel uncertain. And if you've got some savings, which a lot of people do, you fear for your savings. What will happen to my savings? They will disappear. So fear was one element which was important. Identity was also important, crucially important, and that was much less discussed. Because money also gives you identity. And money made the Greeks European. Euro makes you a true European. This is a peripheral country, you see, on the outskirts of Europe. And through the euro, a lot of people felt it would become like the Germans. They didn't, but that's what they thought. So the idea that you'd go away from that back to the drachma felt like a historic retrogression. Felt like a loss of identity. Felt like something that would be a historic defeat. And that was cultivated from the top by the ruling elite, by the Greek ruling bloc, which knew that this would be effective, and they cultivated it all the time. The euro is progress. Progress by left foot. But it was cultivated from the top, and people accepted it. So that's at the level of the people. Why did the left go with it, though? The left went with it because the Greek left in particular, and that's characteristic of the left across Europe, had lost any belief in its own ability to organize society. Fundamentally, the left did not believe in its own words. It can talk about capitalism, it can talk about transforming the world, it can be very, very revolutionary in coffee shops and elsewhere. But when it comes to the euro is where my pension gets paid. Right? So that is, we don't tackle that. In other words, the left showed a lack of confidence in itself, and that went together with the fear and identity problems. And the mix was deadly in the case of Greece. When you look at Britain, things are even more complex. Why? When I went to Britain for the first time to live there 40 years ago, the British left, which is not known for being a particular hotbed of Marxism, it's Britain we're talking about here, had a very strong component of the left in the Labour Party. These were committed socialists and people who believed, and some of them were Marxists. And they were very critical of the Soviet Union. Michael Foot, Barbara Castle, you name it. There were several of them, and they were right. What they said about the European Union was absolutely right. They were right. They've been proven right in the course of the last 4 decades. They existed, and they formulated an argument, and a lot of working people didn't want the European Union. It felt like entering a terrain in which they would lose workers' rights and so on, and that's how it's turned out. 40 years later, that same left, I mean the Labour left, hasn't got any component of that. Suddenly this left, which was perhaps the most Eurosceptic among the social democratic lefts in Europe, has become the most Europhile. You get a source, if you're looking for people who are arguing for reversing the referendum, in other words, going directly against democracy, you'll find them in the Labour Party. They're among the most vocal, and often on the left, using a left argumentation for it. Why? Why is this part of the left become so Europhile? The answer is lack of belief in itself. It's the succession of defeats of the last 30 years under Mrs. Thatcher. The sense that we've got no control over events, that what we say doesn't cut it, the fear of being left alone with the Tories. Because if you're left alone with the Tories will beat you. It's an astonishing idea, and yet that's what's at bottom, and that's what a lot of people like. We need the European Union to protect ourselves. I mean, it's absurd, but that's what people say because they don't believe in themselves. They don't believe in their own ability to organize the working class, to face the employer, to face the domestic organizations of the ruling class, and to defend the rights of workers. In the end, it's the inability of the left to believe in its own skills to confront capitalism. And that's what's behind it. That's what's behind seeking recourse to the European Union, and that is the biggest problem we're going to face as a left in Europe in the years to come, because that's not going to go away quickly. That is there. We now know from the Greek experience and from the British experience that other countries will be similar, and if you wish for radical change, as you should, if you wish for social change, as you should, that will have to be confronted, and that will not be easy to beat in Sweden or in any other country in Europe, I would argue. Thank you. Thank you.